Welcome aboard.
Introducing me, Axios One Big Thing host and editor, Nyla Boodoo. Good morning, everyone. Thank you so much for being here this morning. We're so excited to have you here and to talk about free speech on campus events. As you just heard, I'm Nyla Boodoo. I host our Axios podcast called One Big Thing. Our latest episode is out this morning. Please feel free to get it wherever you get your podcasts. So if you're following along on social media, please use the hashtag Axios Events. This morning, we are going to be discussing free speech on college campuses, the state of play, what's working, what's not working, and what policy leaders and experts think needs to be done to move forward. And just to note, these conversations are not going to be specifically about one conflict, issue, or moment in history. We're going to be talking about free speech as a whole on college campuses. Full disclosure, just as a journalistic note, in my volunteer life, I am actually on the board of trustees for my alma mater, Calvin University. Calvin University, nor any of its board members had any input or influence over this event, and Axios oversees all of our events and maintains the highest editorial integrity for everything that we do. One other programming note, the House Committee on Education and Workforce Chairwoman, Virginia Fox, was scheduled to join us, but ended up not being able to make it this morning. However, we look forward to hopefully having her at a future Axios event and gain her perspective. With that said, all of those housekeeping aside, let's start our conversations this morning. Our first guest joining me on stage is a partner at Wilkie, Fair, and Gallagher. He's also a lecturer at the School of Law at the University of Virginia and the former chief investigative counsel for the U.S. Select Committee to investigate the January 6th attack on the United States Capitol. Please join me in welcoming Timothy Haupy. Hi, Tim. Good morning. Thanks for being with us.
My pleasure. Thanks for the invitation.
So you led investigations after Charlottesville in August 2017, and I said, as I just noted, for the House Select Committee to investigate the January 6th attack on the Capitol. Can we start with lessons? Are there commonalities that you found in the after-action reports that are important for us to begin with as we set the stage here today?
Yes, absolutely. So I was fortunate enough to both do an independent review of the Charlottesville Unite the Right events in 2017, and then the attack on the Capitol.
Move your mic up a little.
And there are a lot of commonalities between the two events. Law enforcement failures, failure to appreciate intelligence, suggesting violence, a passive approach, and not operationalizing the threat of violence. And the use of social media and organizing those events, how it brings people together, how a lot of Americans get their information. And then ultimately, both events were sort of started with a core impetus and organizing principle. It was Civil War statues in Charlottesville, allegations of election fraud at the Capitol, but they kind of metastasized into much broader forums for anger and grievance at institutions.
What specifically did you take away from UVA when we talk about the balance of free speech and public safety?
Well, I was general counsel at UVA after the events of Unite the Right, and it's fundamentally sometimes difficult for universities or governments to fulfill their core constitutional obligation to protect free speech, but also to keep people safe. Public forums like university campuses have to accommodate all kinds of offensive speech, and offensive speech generates strong emotion and often leads to conflict. And for schools or local governments, like in the city of Charlottesville, the tension between those two obligations can be really difficult to maintain.
How important do you think independent reviews are when situations like this happen?
Tremendously important. After an event like this, regardless of whether it goes well or not well, it's crucial to sort of pause, mine lessons learned. In Charlottesville, after Unite the Right, there was a lot of anger in the community. And the city, just by launching an independent review, giving me and our team access to information, and then letting us tell the story without any alteration or hiding of any of those facts. That was the first step toward restoring confidence, right? Effective organizations are self-critical, and independent reviews after the fact help derive those lessons and restore public confidence.
And how is that different than the work that you did when it comes to January 6th in the Capitol?
Well, it's similar. I do think that after January 6th, there was a similar desire, public desire, for understanding how those events came together and telling of a credible narrative as to what happened, what the forces were that led to the attack on the Capitol, is the first step toward healing and preventing future conflicts. I'd like to think that the work of the Select Committee educated the people, but also made a future attack on the Capitol less likely because of the lessons learned that we identified.
And so just because of how important that is, can you just underscore some of those lessons for us?
Yeah, absolutely. Again, going back to the commonalities between Charlottesville and the Capitol, we writ large, institutions, continually misassess danger. We overestimate danger, in my view, when it comes from people of color, and we underestimate danger when it comes from middle-aged white guys. That's something we got to focus on and fix. We also need to understand how Americans now get their information. It's through curated social media feeds, no longer an objective, read the front page and whatever's there, but echo chambers that pump to Americans things that are based upon their prior engagement. And that allows misinformation to proliferate, and it allows people to live in these echo chambers. Those are real issues with which we have to struggle if we're going to not only prevent horrific events of political violence from happening, but just get better at living in a diverse, democratic society.
And how do you see those lessons different or amplified on college campuses versus as we're talking about the country as a whole?
Yeah, very, very much applicable on college campuses. Again, just like the government in Charlottesville, college administrators now have volatile situations where they have to protect the free speech of protesters, even if that speech is offensive. As long as it doesn't directly incite violence or threaten an identifiable person or group, then it's protected. Yet the words that we're hearing on college campuses are creating very strong feelings of a lack of safety, particularly by Jewish students. So how do colleges reconcile that tension? There's a legal tension. The First Amendment conflicts sometimes with Title VI. Title VI requires colleges to ensure that the learning environment is not hostile to any shared national origin group. So simultaneously protecting speech, but also creating an environment in which everyone feels safe is really, really difficult. And colleges need to navigate that in real time.
So you told me something interesting backstage that you teach a course at UVA. It's called Riots and Law, which is a fascinating course title name. Everything you just described to me there about free speech, I think, was a pretty good summation of the First Amendment in terms of your understanding of it. Do you think that on college campuses there is that understanding of what the First Amendment is?
No. I encountered in my investigation going back to Charlottesville and in my classes at UVA now a fundamental misunderstanding about the breadth of First Amendment protection. The First Amendment protects hate speech. It protects racist speech. Again, unless the speech incites imminent lawless action, it cannot be restricted in a public forum, like a public university. And there are a lot of my students that just don't really get that. They think, well, we should shut down the Unite the Right rally. Why did we let them come? Well, we can't. Government has to make decisions that are content neutral. Government doesn't decide which speech is okay and which speech is not okay. If we go down that path, then lots of things that one person thinks is valid, anti-police protests, for example, in the wake of George Floyd, could by some government be deemed as intimidating and shut down. So content neutral regulation is enshrined in American law for years, and a lot of the generation of students with which I interact, not all of them fully understand the value of that.
I have a lot of family in the UK. I actually started my career as a journalist in the UK, and I think, there's a fundamental different understanding of what hate speech is in the UK versus here. What you're describing generationally, do you feel like younger generations are maybe moving to a shift, regardless of what the Constitution says, of saying hate speech should not happen?
Yeah, it's hard to generalize. I don't know that this generation doesn't think hate speech should be protected. I do think there's something going on generationally. I think the students that I teach at UVA have grown up in a culture of a lot of parental involvement, a lot of trigger warnings in safe spaces. They have an expectation of the university almost as an extension of their parents. When I was in college, I wanted the university to stay out of my way and out of my business and not tell me what to think or what to do. This generation of students, many, I can't paint with a totally broad brush, looks to the university for protection, looks for the university to make public statements. And that's a really different and interesting generational change that I think we're dealing with.
You wrote something in the Chronicle for Higher Education that good leaders are willing to evaluate their own decisions in an effort to inform future institutional response. So my question is, given the myriad of stakeholders and cultural battles at play here, how hard is it for leaders to make these decisions that we are talking about here?
Yeah, it's risky because you are laying bare a lot of sausage making that's really hard. Going down the road of a review is going to uncover a lot of the raw material that may not be flattering. It may put leaders or the organization in a bad light. But it's healthy in any relationship or any organizational culture to be willing to look at yourself critically. And my advice to universities, or my advice based on Charlottesville and January 6th, is that while there are short-term costs in terms of that information coming out, there's a long-term gain. You benefit from it. There are also a lot of issues with what is privileged and what is not. Are you setting up some potential claims against the organization? It really depends on the situation. The review that I did in Charlottesville was attorney-client privileged, but the privilege was waived and we disclosed in full everything that we found. So there are legal issues that have to be navigated, but overall, really healthy for an organization to be willing to look under the hood and assess what went right and what went wrong.
So we've been talking about generations. I just want to end by asking, we spent a lot of time talking about students. Do you feel that college administrators and universities have a clear sense of what we've been talking about and are equipped to handle this?
No and no. My clients at UVA were some of the smartest people in the world whose values I endorsed 100%. They had no clue how to manage a mass demonstration. They're not equipped. In lots of organizations, we promote people because they're good at something into a management position where they suddenly have to deal with things with which they're not familiar. So college administrators, by and large, again, you can't paint with a completely broad brush, have no clue, generally. They understand the First Amendment maybe, but then navigating really fraught issues of public safety, where to draw the line between protection of community safety versus free speech, those are really hard decisions that they're trying their best, but they're not always equipped, based on their experience, to implement.
Well, I'm afraid we're going to have to leave it at that, but thank you very much for being with us this morning, Tim Hapey.
My pleasure. Thank you.
Please welcome to the stage Axios senior reporter Erica Pandy.
Hello, everyone. Thank you again for joining us. I'm Erica Pandy. I'm a senior reporter at Axios. I'm also the co-author of Axios Finish Line with my two bosses, Mike Allen and Jim Vandehei. So if you're not subscribed, do me a favor, go to axios.com/newsletters. Our second guest is not only an expert in free speech, but also works, sorry, we're not great at handheld mics, but also works at a university. He is the David Boies Professor of Law at Yale Law School and the founding chair of the Academic Freedom Alliance. Please welcome Professor Keith Whittington. So when we were catching up kind of ahead of this event, one thing you mentioned that I thought was a great way to frame the conversation today was there's kind of two sources of pressure on campuses, right? There's that internal pressure from students, faculty, whether that's, protesting someone coming to speak or something like that, but there's also the external pressure from state legislatures saying, here's what you can and can't teach. Can you explain those two sides and kind of the difference between those two pressures and whether they're equally scary?
Well, I think they're both quite worrisome about the future of free speech on campuses. And it's relatively new phenomenon for there to be lots of pressure from inside the university to shut down speech in various ways. Traditionally, universities were places that were pressing for more speech to occur on campus. But that's not so true anymore. There's lots of, as you say, faculty, administrators, and students who think there ought to be less speech on campus. Those pressures are often coming from the left on campus, in part because campuses are overwhelmingly left-wing spaces. And that sometimes means pressure against conservative speakers, but maybe it also means internal pressures within the left itself, in which there are demands that faculty not say certain things in the classroom or outside the classroom. There are demands that certain speakers not come to campus and say certain things. And then likewise, there are lots of pressures from outside campus. Those pressures are often coming from the right, but those come lately, especially from politicians, and we're seeing governments getting into that. But before that, we were seeing activists off campus who are organized to patrol speech on campus and put pressure on universities. We see pressure from parents and donors and alumni on campuses, all of which universities pay attention to and makes them very cautious about speech.
And when we were chatting, I mean, it was kind of in the flurry of the presidential news we've had, and the spring feels like it was 10 million years ago. And I said, okay, well, the protest thing is kind of over, right? And you said, no, watch the fall, I expect more. Tell me what you're looking for in the fall.
Well, I was certainly expecting that there'd be a lot of protest in the fall regardless because of the upcoming election. And I think we've seen that in the last two election cycles, certainly dramatic flare-ups of conflicts over speech on university campuses. I don't think this fall is going to be any different from that perspective. Meanwhile, we're going to still see conflicts over the war relating to Israel. That doesn't seem to be going away. There's no reason to imagine that the kinds of protests we saw in the spring aren't simply going to restart when we get to the fall semester.
And one of the key headlines from the spring from a number of outlets was just kind of how royally most campuses bungled the response, right? You had donors angry, you had students on both sides angry, parents, faculty protesting graduation. Why were universities caught so flat-footed? We talked, in the last conversation about that they were, but why were they caught so flat-footed?
Well, it's a good question, in part because the universities at this point should have had a fair amount of experience with protest on campuses, and they ought to have been better about trying to regulate it. Part of the difficulty is I think universities have been really inconsistent about how they apply their existing rules. They're not very good at explaining to students and other stakeholders on campus what the rules even are. And so even if the university has in place relatively good time, place, and manner regulations, for example, about where you can have protests, when you can have protests, what they can look like, for example, students are often not very aware of them. Even when students are made aware of them, they don't necessarily believe that they're actually going to be enforced. And so they're often testing the limits of what the university will do, and universities have found themselves in a place where they're not willing to enforce their own rules.
Across the landscape, did you see any moves any administrators made that were smart, that were kind of prescient in this moment?
Well, I think some handled it a little better than others. Unfortunately, it's hard to point to anyone and say, well, they did a really bang-up job and the problem was solved there. Partially, it's a function really of not only what the administration did at the university, but also what kinds of protests they're dealing with and how the students responded, and often how people off campus are responding as well. So I think the universities in the New York area, for example, had a really tough task, and that's not simply a question of how the administrators reacted, which which was often not great, but also the fact that there are lots of outsiders who are coming to those campuses very easily. There's a lot of interest in those protest activities, and that makes it much more difficult to manage the population there on campus.
Mm-hmm. And it's a lot less public how universities are dealing with the pressures of these state legislators that are coming in and saying, here's what you can teach, here's what you can talk about. How are they handling that pressure? Are they better at that than they were at this?
No, I wouldn't say they've been very good about that either. I think universities are still trying to navigate how best to deal with that political pressure. I think universities have mostly been trying to work behind the scenes and lobbying legislatures either to encourage them not to pass the more draconian versions of the legislation or to modify the legislation in order to make it more manageable. And then universities are often playing catch up to try to figure out, okay, well, now that the legislatures have responded, how are we going to do our best to live with the legislation that's in front of us, live with that hostile political environment that surrounds us? I think universities would be somewhat well advised to try to get out in front of this a little more, to try to explain more to the public as well as to politicians what universities stand for, why we do what we do, why when people hear outrageous stories about things that are happening on campus, whether or not those things are even true, because sometimes they're not, whether or not they're outliers and can't be easily generalized, and whether or not sometimes they're justifiable. And there's good reasons why things that from the outside may seem crazy that's happening on campus, there's a good reason, given the logic of how campuses operate, why we're doing it.
And we saw faculty get very involved most recently. There were kind of at protests, at counter-protests. We saw faculty protest in and of themselves. What role do professors play whether it comes to protecting speech or supporting students? Where do you kind of fit into all of it?
Well, you did hear a bit of a mantra during some of the protests from some faculty saying our job is to support students. And that's true, of course, to some degree. But you want to support students in doing things that are appropriate for what students ought to be doing. And first and foremost, of course, that's the educational process, and you need to be supporting students in what they're doing educationally. Other than that, faculty, of course, are bound by the exact same kinds of rules that apply to the students themselves when it comes to protest on campus. And so we certainly saw some instances of faculty trying to obstruct police when they're trying to monitor campus. We saw instances of faculty trying to obstruct administrators, trying to enforce rules. And really that's, of course, as inappropriate for faculty to do as it would be for students to do. And faculty are opening themselves up to discipline, in some cases criminal prosecution, for interfering with the university, trying to enforce its own rules, and sometimes trying to enforce civil laws on the campuses themselves.
And we have a little bit of time left. I want to focus on a little bit of an elephant in the room, which is, why do we care so much about universities? You have lawmakers getting involved, right? Like you said, in New York, they became a site of protest, not just for students, but for all kinds of people, all kinds of community members. Why does what happens on campuses and how speech is protected or restricted on campus have implications for all of us?
Well, I think it'd be fair enough to say we maybe ought to worry a little less about what happens on campus. Maybe we're giving too much attention to campuses, and we may be giving too much attention to certain campuses in particular. There is an instinct to run to where the fire is, and so to the extent that we see really spectacular behavior on some particular campuses, we pay a lot of attention to that, don't necessarily pay attention to how other campuses are operating just normally, and it gives us a misleading impression of how the university environment operates more generally. But more basically, I think universities are a bit of a bellwether about the nature of free speech in society more broadly. They are the places where the most controversial ideas ought to be discussed, have traditionally been discussed, both in a public setting and in an academic setting. And if you can't have good public discussions, free and vibrant public discussions in a university campus, it really says bad things about American society as a whole. And so I think it is important to take these moments to be an opportunity to try to understand, okay, how do we approach free speech in America? What's the scope of free speech? What's the nature of the proper restrictions on free speech? And not only how should we play that out on a college campus, but also how should we play it out elsewhere?
And you said earlier in the conversation, which is, a true thing, everybody knows that universities are kind of leaning liberal, overwhelmingly liberal spaces in some cases. Are they still kind of that forum for all kinds of speech, or do we need to kind of, make some corrections to get there again?
Well, I think at their best, they certainly are. Universities can be places where very non-intuitive ideas that are way outside the mainstream American society are discussed seriously, can be held up for genuine skepticism. But I don't think universities do as good of a job of that as they could. There's sometimes less tolerance of that in the academic space itself. That doesn't help that universities are overwhelmingly liberal spaces. They ought to make more space for conservative thought across the universities as a whole. And likewise, universities have not always been great about trying to make their public spaces as accessible and available as possible for the range of speech. And in part, it goes back to this question about the internal pressures on speech that we've mentioned before, where there are people on campus who very much want to impose real limits on what kinds of ideas can be talked about, and they're interested in trying to restrict speech on campus itself. And so it wasn't very many years ago, the legislatures, instead of themselves trying to restrict speech on campus, were instead thinking about, okay, what's the right kind of model legislation we could adopt that would try to protect more campus free speech. And in some ways, I wish we were back in that world where legislatures were more concerned about how do we protect speech better on campus rather than trying to figure out, well, here are some ideas I don't like as a politician. How can I restrict that speech?
We have about a minute left. I want to end on a fun note. What is your favorite thing about teaching young law students?
They're extraordinarily interested and they're smart. And so in general, one of the great wonders of teaching is you're exposing students to new ideas, things they haven't encountered before. It's part of the great thing about being in universities in general as a faculty member broadly, but certainly in a classroom context, to get students thinking about something they haven't thought very hard about before is really a wonderful experience. And it doesn't always click, but when it does, there's nothing like it.
Thank you so much. That is all the time we
you.
have. Thank you, Professor Whittington. Up next, quick word from our partner, the Knight Foundation, and I'll be back here with one final guest that you won't want to miss. Thank you so much.
Introducing our View from the Top moderator and founder of Storyline, Chris Freites.
Hey, good morning. Thank you all for joining us, and I want to offer a big thanks to our sponsor, the Knight Foundation, for making this conversation possible. And now I'd like to welcome from the Knight Foundation their Vice President of Learning and Impact, Ashley Zahn. Ashley. So I'm excited to talk with you today because the Knight Foundation has played such a big role in this issue. And I wonder, why is freedom of expression so important to the Knight Foundation?
Thanks, Chris, and thanks for having us and having this event. We're really excited about it. So we all know how important freedom of expression is to our democracy. And Knight Foundation was founded over 70 years ago by John S. and James L. Knight, who owned Knight newspapers. And they believed that a well-informed community is essential to a well-functioning and representative democracy. You can't have that without freedom of speech and freedom of the press. If we can't express ourselves, if we can't challenge authority, we can't pursue our own interests. And so, in addition to the grant making that the foundation is known for, we also commission research on topics that we care about. We've studied everything from what makes you love where you live to trust in media. We have a new partnership with the Pew Research Center called the Pew Knight Initiative, which is all about how Americans engage with civic information. But our longest running research series is actually on what attitudes towards free expression, and it's actually been one of our most important research series over time.
So I want to talk about that because on Tuesday, Knight and Ipsos put out a new study, and you guys measure attitudes towards free expression from college students. And I wonder, what trends have you seen over the last 8 years as you've tracked this?
Absolutely. We're really excited to put this report out at this really important time. So, as you mentioned, we've been studying student attitudes for a long time, and I think that's really important in this context because we've been talking a lot about free speech on campus this year, but we really need to look back over time and understand the trends. The other thing I want to elevate is that we believe it's really important to hear from the students whose lives are being shaped by the policies on campus. And so that's why we do this research. And we have seen some really important trends over the last 8 years. And the most important one is that Since 2016, we've seen a dramatic decline in the percentage of students who feel like free speech is secure in America today. So back in 2016, 73% of students believed that free speech is secure. In the report we just put out, 43% of students. So it's a 30 percentage point drop in just 8 years. That being said, students value their speech. 90% of them say that free speech is important to them. And when they're asked to choose whether campuses should allow students to be exposed to speech that they might find offensive or protect them from speech they might find offensive, the majority of students think speech should be allowed and that they should be exposed to speech. We are seeing, though, that the minority who wants to be protected is growing. And so it's something that we think we need to pay attention to. Overall, though, students are think that their campus environments prevent people from saying things that others might find offensive.
That's fascinating. And I think it's so important to actually talk to the students. I mean, we talk so much about students, to actually hear how they're experiencing it is so important. I wonder, what is the newest thing that you've seen? We heard a question earlier about hate speech and what the college kids think about that. I wonder, what did you find this time around that was different than what you've seen in the last 8 years?
Absolutely. And so I'll take that question first, since it came up earlier. So we do ask students if they think hate speech should be legally protected. And they're actually split about 50-50 in terms of a slight majority actually don't think hate speech should be protected. But it actually used to be fewer. So we're actually seeing more students thinking hate speech should be protected. But they really don't want hate speech on their campus, it seems like. So 75% of students don't think hate speech should be allowed on campus. But in the we got a lot of new things in the report, so I'd love for everybody to check it out. A few other things I want to point out. One is we're really seeing students be much more uncomfortable with their own speech and their own ability to express themselves. So this year, students are less likely to say that people like them can say whatever they want. And that's especially true for Black students. The other thing is that for the first time this year, we dove into self-censorship and the extent to which students are not willing to say their own beliefs, particularly in the classroom. We wanted to understand, how does it affect the educational environment? And two-thirds of students believe that self-censorship hinders the educational value of things that are happening on campus, and yet they themselves self-censor. Exactly.
Wow.
So they know that it's affecting the environment, but they're afraid to say what they believe. So we asked in a classroom if they might self-censor on any number of topics that might come up, like race, gender, LGBTQ, religion, etc. And on any given issue, between 25 and 40% of students would not say what they really believe.
Wow. So they're learning it very early. I mean, this is something that I think is happens across our society, right? Like, how many meetings have you been in where people are self-censoring? That's fascinating. So I wonder, when you look at this research, what does it tell us about college students, what they think about speech, what they want out of their college educations? What are the implications of what you found?
Absolutely. And I think we all think of college as a place where you go to get new knowledge, to be exposed to ideas, and that colleges have an opportunity because they're shaping the future leaders of our democracy. And so we should hear from them and respond to what they think. And the first thing is that they are actually interested in learning how to productively disagree. And so we had only about a third of them know of any program on their campus to learn how to better have a constructive conversation with someone you disagree. And the ones who knew that nothing like that existed on their campus, more than half of them are actually interested in that kind of programming. The other thing that we found is that students, there's a relationship between the extent to which students trust the faculty and administration, and their own openness to sharing their ideas.
Really?
Yeah. And so if campuses work to improve the trust between the faculty and administration, it's also likely to affect the speech environment.
That's fascinating. I wouldn't have put those two things together.
No.
So it's on administrators to help foster that environment.
Absolutely. I mean, as they shape the environment on campus, thinking about that trust is really, really important.
So we have just about 2 minutes left.
Yeah.
And I wonder, we have a great audience here today. What's the one thing, if they walk out of here, that they should take away from this year's study and where we're headed on this issue?
Absolutely. So we do this study to make sure that student voices are heard. So journalists, national commentators, we're encouraging folks to listen to the students. And students can use it to elevate their own perspective and say, I think this, but also most of my colleagues do. But we really, to this point before, we really want campus leaders and faculty to hear that students are struggling. They want to figure out how to balance these free speech principles with this uncomfort with speech, as well as kind of what does it mean to hear and discuss ideas I disagree with. So we hope that colleges and universities will lean in to this opportunity to really help students both express their ideas and engage in productive dialogue. It's there's a lot to be done before the school year starts, but it's also an incredible opportunity for these campuses.
What do you think, what advice would you give administrators in how to foster that?
Yeah, I mean, it's really about listening, and back to that point about building trust. And on some campuses, that trust may have been broken in the spring. And so how do leaders and faculty and administrators restore that trust this fall?
That's a great point. We have to leave it there. We are out of time. Ashley Zahn is the Vice President of Impact and Learning at the Knight Foundation. Ashley, thank you for joining us, and thank you to Knight for putting on this amazing event.
Thanks, Chris.
Welcoming back to the stage, it's me again, Nyla Boodoo.
Now let's get a view on this from Capitol Hill. Missouri Senator Eric Schmidt serves on the Committee of Armed Services as well as Commerce, Science, and Transportation. Please welcome Republican Senator Eric Schmidt. Good morning. Thanks for being here with us.
Sure.
So, we began this hour, I was talking to Tim Hapey about the First Amendment, and I wanted to start by asking you what your definition or understanding is of what speech is allowed and prohibited by the First Amendment.
Well, I think taking a step back and understanding what the First Amendment really represents is the most important thing, and I think that has been lost, I think, in the lack of civics education, whether it's at K through 12 or even on college campuses. It protects fundamental human expression. We believe in our country in individual rights, and paramount in that is that people can express themselves. They can have a point of view, whether it's certainly the written word, the spoken word. There's a reason why it was the very First Amendment, the ability to have a free and open press, to petition your government. These are things that we believe, and I believe, are just sort of fundamental to the human experience. And I'm sort of one of these people that, when you get into these discussions, I'm sure we will, of what qualifies and what doesn't, to me, you combat speech you don't like with more speech, not censorship. And I do think there's a growing trend, even among government leaders, to creep into this space with justification, to put pressure on these platforms, because a lot of these discussions have transformed from the public square, the traditional public square, to the online town square, right? And there's a danger in that in one way, in that you don't have face-to-face conversations as much. And I think that's really important because you're able to process how someone is receiving information. We're in a different place now, right? Where it can be anonymous, but it's certainly faceless in many ways.
So you are a senator now. Of course, you were the Attorney General of Missouri when the case that was heard before the Supreme Court this term, Murthy versus Missouri, which had to do with alleging that the Biden administration was censoring big tech and tech platforms. The Supreme Court disagreed with that, and the Fifth Circuit. I'm just curious your thoughts on that. On this.
Only for lack of standing. They didn't really reach the merits. But yeah, I was the Attorney General that brought that case. And I think what was uncovered was chilling. So the big takeaway for me is what was exposed. And you got to remember, this was before Twitter files. This was in May of 2022. And I mean this sincerely, I don't care what your political stripe is. A lot of this stuff ought to scare the bejesus out of every American. The brazen attempts to put pressure on social media companies to take down posts. So you had essentially the power of the federal government colluding with some of the biggest companies in the history of the world. In an individual, you have no real recourse. And so we brought the case, it was exposed. My hope is that we take a step back from that. And again, it doesn't matter what political parties in power controls those levers, the ability for people to sort of have a point of view, even if it's one you disagree with, and even if it's one you think is outrageous, censorship should be sort of out of bounds here.
So I should note that Justice Coney Barrett actually said that, to your point of the standing, that the factual findings of the district court unfortunately appeared to be erroneous. So I'm just curious your thoughts on that. If she's
but that's not sort of dicta, right? That's not the actual ruling. And by the way, there's a federal judge in the federal circuit court too said this was Orwellian. So again, whether you think it got to a point of coercion or not, the fact is the emails are the emails. The text messages are the text messages. And when you have the Surgeon General of the United States texting directly with a senior vice president of a social media company saying, take this down or else, and then them responding, say, we did that, what else can we do? I don't know. This ought to be something that unites Americans, in my view. I don't view that as a particularly partisan thing. I think it's just dangerous.
Mm-hmm. So what do you think now as we're thinking about this upcoming election, as we talk about platforms, misinformation? We know that there are foreign actors that are actively engaged in disinformation campaigns to destabilize American democracy. How do you suggest platforms, what's your philosophy of how platforms should be dealing with that?
Well, I think they have to choose. So there's two buckets. There's what is the government's role, right? And that's when you get to the censorship,
Sure.
right? What's prohibited by the First Amendment. And so that's what that case was about, which was a little bit different. And personally, I think that we need to change the culture of people who think they can do this within government. But on the private side, they are private businesses, but they kind of have to choose. The reason why they have Section 230 protections is because in 1996 in the Telecommunications Act, they were protected and they were given immunity because they're an open platform. They're not a publisher. You know, Axios, if it writes something that's libelous, can be sued. The social media companies are immune from that because they're held out as an open forum. So they kind of have to pick. That's my point of view. And so,
what do you think they should be if they have to pick?
If I had my way, they'd be an open platform.
Okay.
That you could actually have people go on there and have this airing out. And I do think from a society perspective, the First Amendment is sort of this pressure release valve. You know, this idea in this country is that we can solve our differences and get to resolution through elections and speech, not through political violence, is a really important thing to hold on to. And so the more that people feel like they can be heard, whether it's on a college campus or online, I think that helps. Again, it's sort of cathartic. And so my hope is that they would be true platforms. But I do think it's dangerous. Do I think there's disinformation and misinformation? Yes. But I also think it's being used by some for more power and more control over other people's speech.
Senator, let's talk about college campuses. All of the protests that we saw this past school year, particularly at the end of the school year. How do you think colleges like Columbia should have handled it?
Well,
particular when it comes, obviously, to the Israel-Gaza war.
Sure. I think students need to be protected. I mean, you had images of Jewish students, you know, fearing for their lives locked in a library. That's totally unacceptable. But people do have a right to have objectionable points of view. right? People have the ability to say things that you don't agree with and that you find despicable. And so I think that college administrators, in many ways, have sort of created this problem in that only one side of a debate is often heard. And I'm 49, so that's pretty young in the Senate. It's pretty old in real life. But when I was in college, I sought out lectures or speeches from speakers that I didn't agree with. I think there's got to be a cultural shift where that's more acceptable. You can't have one point of view sort of in the bleachers.
So when you're saying only one side, you're saying the liberal side.
Oh, yeah. Absolutely.
So it's interesting because as we were just looking at the report from the Knight Foundation, how students who are students of color or who are LGBT say they're self-censoring because they're afraid.
Yeah, I've heard that might be true. And that's wrong too, right? People should be able to speak out. But I've heard from plenty of conservative students who don't feel like they can express themselves in a classroom because they're going to get a bad grade. That's, I think, where we've gotten, and that's wrong. And that takes leadership to correct. But again, I'm old enough to remember when liberals actually espoused the idea of free speech. And I think the pressures you see on the restrictions on free speech, if you're being honest about it, most of it's coming from the left.
So I'm curious what you think Congress's role should be in regulating this. Your colleagues in the House floated some ideas around restricting research funding, tax exemption, potentially more for universities that don't take action against anti-Semitic activity. Are you planning on supporting or introducing anything in the Senate regarding that?
Well, I think, again, you have to have the distinction between pure speech and then the violence or sort of occupation of campuses. Those are two different things, right? Mm-hmm. But I also think that, for me, legislation that I brought forward, I think that tackles the root cause and the fundamental issue here is, for social media companies, you got to choose. If you're going to engage in this kind of censorship, you don't get Section 230 protections. And on the government side, if you're an individual government actor, if you're a bureaucrat that's engaged in censorship, you yourself can be sued individually by an individual for violating their First Amendment rights. I think right now, there's no real accountability for people who violate that, and I think that dynamic needs to change. It shouldn't have to be one attorney general or 5 attorneys general suing it. I think empowering an army of citizens would be a smart move.
In a few minutes, our last guest is we're going to be hearing from the DOE's Assistant Secretary Catherine Lehman about civil rights investigations. Of course, it's the Department of Justice that's charged with protecting free speech. What's your philosophy about what the DOJ should be doing around this?
Well, I think the Department of Justice has lost a lot of credibility, to be perfectly honest with you. I think their desire to pursue political opponents does great harm to the trust that people have in our institutions. And that has widespread ramifications. But, I think this Justice Department is overtly political. And so I don't think there's a lot of trust that they would be even-handed about it.
One last question for you as we're deep into this presidential campaign cycle, and we were just talking about the Department of Justice. Your name has surfaced as a potential Attorney General pick should former President Trump be reelected. Have you had any conversations with him about that?
I am very focused on being a senator from Missouri. And by the way, helping him win. There's no secret I support President Trump. But that's not my focus right now. So I know that's a very Washington answer, but it's the truth. I was going to
say, so no conversations?
I'm trying to help him win, and I'm trying to represent the people in my state. That's it.
All right. Well, unfortunately, that is all the time we have. Senator Schmidt, thank you for joining me this
morning.
Thank you
for hosting this. Yep.
Please stick around for our final guest this morning as well.
Welcoming back to the stage, Erica Pandy.
Up next is our final guest this morning. She is the Assistant Secretary for Civil Rights at the U.S. Department of Education. Please welcome Catherine E. Lehman. Secretary Lehman, welcome to Axios. Thanks for being here.
Thank you.
Today's a big day for you, but I want to get to that a little bit later. I want to start by asking you a little bit about the fact that your office has been the one fielding all of the cases and complaints that have come out of campuses in these last, several months of turmoil.
Yes.
Obviously not speaking to any particular case, but high level, what is your sense of the campus climate based on what you've seen come across your desk?
I am a lifelong civil rights lawyer and a lifelong civil rights enforcer, and I am shocked and appalled by the quantum of discrimination that we see in schools. Certainly many of us have read about it and heard about it in the news. What I see in the investigations that we conduct in schools is astonishing to me about the degree to which in the country right now, we think it's okay to tell someone that they're not valid because of who they are, they're not welcome because of who they are, and that they shouldn't be part of a campus community. It's astonishing to me, and I think it's a new low.
And you're seeing an increasing number of these, right? During your tenure even?
Oh, it's an enormous increase. Just in the time since October 7th, we have now some 150 cases in investigation. We've recently resolved about 15 cases, and the cases just keep coming. And I think that understates the quantum of harm that people experience. Not everybody decides to come to the federal government for redress. Not everybody decides to use the complaint process that we have.
And because you've got all this data and your office sees exactly how these disputes over free speech kind of play out and how hate on campus is actually affecting students, can you tell us a bit about the stakes here? You mentioned a little bit. What exactly is keeping you up at night?
Well, I want to take a step back if I can too. Certainly we see a ton of concern about free speech. I also think that there is astonishing misconception that there is some kind of contrast or divide between protecting, respecting free speech rights and not discriminating. There is no necessary conflict between respecting and protecting our fundamental free speech rights and protecting every student's right to be in school, to learn in an environment where the student isn't discriminated against because of who the student is. And so I think one of the things that I'm so astonished by is the degree of paralysis on that question, where I see so many universities taking the position that they can't even address something because it's speech. And actually that's not right. It may be that you can't discipline the speaker because the speech is protected, and I support that, but that's not the end of the inquiry. The inquiry has to also be, are the students who are Jewish, are the students who are Palestinian, are the students who are Arab on campus safe? Do they feel like they can learn? Do they feel like they can access the entire educational community? And are they experiencing discrimination? And that one of the tests that we use is to evaluate whether the conduct, and that can include speech, is so severe or pervasive that it limits or denies access to education. So if the conduct rises to that level, including speech, then a university must act to make sure that a student is still able to access education. And that we can't lose sight of that. So, it's such an important part of learning and part of the educational experience in college to recognize how to have difficult conversations, how to talk about topics about which people very strongly disagree. It's also incredibly important just to be able to access math class, just to be able to access the education that you signed up for.
What does that look like from the university's perspective? What are some of the steps they can take to make sure that they are making students feel like they can go to math class?
Right. Well, I think a baseline, a core expectation for every school is to communicate their inclusive values, to communicate to the students, we admitted you because we want you. We expect you to succeed here, and we will support you when we're ready for you. That should be just the ways that college start as a baseline. And then where there's difficult conversations, where there are incidents, where there are protests, where there are parts of the daily life of education, actually, and certainly in the time that we're in now, the colleges also need to be able to assess, did this conduct in the totality of the circumstances, so this or this and the last week and the week before sets of conduct, does that rise to the level that there are students who are unable to access their education? And if so, what are the steps that we can take to support those students so they can? And that might be counseling, that might be creating other conversations, that might be telling students how to file a discrimination complaint and how to access the university resources on that. It isn't to silence a speaker who has a right to speak. But it is still to make sure that all of the students in a campus community are fully supported and fully able to be part of that community.
What's your advice to students heading into the fall who might feel strongly about the election or about the Israel-Hamas war and want to, in good faith, express their passionate views and, do right by their classmates as well?
Well, I hope they'll do exactly what you just said, express their passionate views and do right by their classmates as well. And, we were hearing a lot about that in this session today. It's been a very interesting conversation, I think. And I think it's important for us to recognize there are ways to have those conversations. There are ways to be yourself at school. There are ways to be part of a community that is vibrant and thriving and discussing the issues of the day. That's what I want for my daughter who's a college student. That's what I hope for every college student everywhere. But there's a way to support that and to make sure that that is possible and that students aren't barred from accessing the library, that they aren't barred from going to class, that they don't have to hear over and over slurs about who they are because of someone's stereotypes about who they are, that they're actually able to be part of a vibrant intellectual community, which is college.
Is it about teaching students how to protest?
Well, at minimum, sure. It's also about teaching students how to be part of an intellectual community, how to debate, how to learn and how to share ideas, how to be open to somebody else's ideas, how to stretch your mind. That's what college is.
So I want to get to, we have a news peg today. Today is, one of the biggest moves during your tenure has been some key changes to the Title IX regulations.
That's right.
And it's a years-long process that went into effect this morning.
Yes.
So congratulations on that.
Thank you. Thank you.
And I want to get into one of the bigger changes within those regulations, which was how sexual harassment on campus is dealt with and what the university's purview is. Can you explain a little bit about what changed and why it's important?
Well, sure. And just to say, since we're shifting topics a little bit, we're talking about Title IX of the Education Amendments of 1972, and they protect against sex discrimination in school. The beautiful, now 52-year-old guarantee from Congress is that no person shall experience discrimination on the basis of sex. And what we did in these new regulations that take effect today in 24 states and the District of Columbia and Puerto Rico is to put in the reg text what that guarantee means, and to say explicitly in law that the protection against sex discrimination extends to all forms of sex discrimination. And specifically with respect to sex-based harassment, we are clear that any student can experience sex-based harassment. We are clear about the standards that schools need to use to evaluate that harassment and to make sure that harassment doesn't impede a student's access to education. So I am very excited about the states that will implement it. I look forward to continuing to defend this, and I'm very proud that these new regulations are the most comprehensive regulations since 1975 when the department first regulated. Thank you. Thank you.
And there's also a piece that expands protection for LGBTQ plus students, right?
Well, to be clear, that piece puts in the regulation that protection. It's always been there. That's what the law has been, but there's been quite a bit of confusion about that. And so we thought it was important to make it clear and to make sure that no student and no school misunderstands that the promise in the statute that no person experiences discrimination very much extends to LGBTQI plus persons who are people too.
Absolutely. At Axios, we're all about few words, but sometimes more words are better. I want to end with one fun thing. We talked about this a little bit backstage. In the interest of free speech, what is your hottest take about DC?
I guess
As
my
a California
hottest thing
native.
about DC is that it's hot. I'm from California. This is a lot, But I am from California, and it's really nice to be able to enjoy the public transportation and the many free museums and the public art that is available in DC too. So. I do believe that any responsible federal government would have been cited in California, but I'll take DC as a second bet.
Thank you so much, Secretary Lehman. That is all the time we have.
Thank you very much.
We want to thank our partner, once again, the Knight Foundation. Thank you all for being here, and thank you for the amazing